Last week, Derek kicked us off in a section of Exodus and also Numbers. And by doing so, he set up for us to begin to recognize some of the extended story arcs in Scripture. And one of the things that he suggested is that we tend to read Scripture the way we like our TV shows, episodal, where you can pop in, get one, enjoy it, and then you're off to another one. But Scripture, and especially Torah, these first 5 books of the Bible, there are some overarching stories that are connected, and Derek helped us to begin to see the structure of those stories. Hebrew stories are mountainous. If you take a look at your sermon notes, you'll see a triangle, which is, kind of in the shape of a mountain, which is also in the shape of a Hebrew story. This is the way that the Hebrews like to tell their good stories. And in our passage this morning, we are going to have the chance to see Hebrew storytelling, this pattern of it 2 different times. The first story will be sort of half of a story, and it'll be about water, and it'll give us the chance to sort of reorient ourselves to this way of storytelling that Derek introduced us to last week. And that is before we jump into our sort of much longer story about food. Because who wouldn't rather spend more of our time talking about food than water? To set the stage for our first story, then, let me sort of catch us up, remind us where we've been. A people called Israel have been set free from bitter slavery in the land of Egypt. But these people didn't just escape, sneak out the back door. While they were still afflicted, God made very specific promises to these people that he would bring them out of Egypt, that he would deliver them from Egypt, that he would redeem them. And then through a series of miraculous plagues, God demonstrated his ability to control the natural world. God showed himself to be more powerful than Egypt's gods, and especially Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. God then begins to lead these newly freed Israelites through the wilderness in order to fulfill his 4th promise that he made to them, that he would take them into the land that he had promised his fathers. Free from bitter slavery in Egypt, God leads Israel 3 days into the wilderness, where they come to the Red Sea. Pharaoh and the Egyptian army, regretting their decision to let the Israelites go, they come after the Israelites with everything they've got, horses and chariots and their army. The Israelites are only 3 days removed from Egypt's grip, and they know too well the strength of Egypt, and so they are afraid as this army comes at them, and they cry out, "Is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us here to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Is not this what we said to you in Egypt in the first place? Leave us alone that we just might serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than for us to die here in the wilderness." So the Israelites, who had been afraid and threatened and trapped, the Israelites, they trusted in that moment the only power that they truly believed in, Egypt and its military strength. That at that point, in spite of all that the Lord had done, Egypt still existed, and Egypt still owned Israel's hearts and minds. But then, as we celebrated together on Resurrection Sunday, God would finish Egypt off. He would provide Israel a safe passage through those waters that had previously blocked their way. That he would crush their former slave masters in their wake. And now, with the threat of Egypt not just behind them, but literally gone, Israel had now been set free to give to God their hearts and their minds. No divided loyalties required. I mean, at this point, besides God, who is left for the Israelites to begin to put their trust in? So that sets the stage for our passage this morning, and we start in Exodus chapter 15. Verse 22. And we remember the 3-day journey through the wilderness to the Red Sea when we began reading here. Then Moses made Israel set out from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. According to the pattern that Derek showed us last week, we discover that we are rehearing a familiar story. This means that what's happening here, we are to evaluate how the Israelites have been changed by whatever happened at the story's climax. Think of that triangle. We're on the downward slope. Since the previous 3 days, the upward slope led to the Red Sea. And these 3 days lead away from the Red Sea. It's safe to say that the events at the Red Sea are the climax of this story. The beginning of their story was in bitter slavery in Egypt, and now they've arrived at a place called Marah with water they could not drink because it was bitter. As we can tell, 3 days is not long enough to undo 400 years in Egypt. But what about the climax of the story, right? Can God's glorious deeds and awesome wonders, as the song in Exodus 15 says, can these make a difference in our lives? Surely God's actions at the Red Sea have to confirm for Israel who this God is. They have seen, and they are even able to respond in song to what God has done. They sing the song of God's salvation with instruments and with dancing, only to travel 3 days and begin to grumble, as verse 24 tells us. But God doesn't seem to be taken aback by Israel's grumbling here. He doesn't at all seem surprised that, like an infant that cries when it's thirsty, they grumble. Because in their existence as God's people, they are but mere infants. And there is no fanfare, and there's no rebuke, and there's no sign of frustration. The Lord simply responds to them by providing for them. The Lord showed Moses a log, and he threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. That's it. Again, for the second time, the Lord has taken away the Israelites' bitterness. The Lord is up to something more here, though. Because we read, there the Lord made for them a statute and a rule, and there he tested them, saying, if you will diligently listen to the voice of the Lord your God and do that which is right in his eyes and give ear to his commandments and keep his statutes, I will put none of the diseases, the plagues on you that I put on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord, your healer. Here we're given a key to much of what is to come as Exodus continues to unfold. The story that is going to be told throughout Torah will be one where the Lord instructs his people and tests whether they will trust his words or not, which makes it important probably to say something about tests. It's common to hear people talk about being tested by God. There are some who think that all of life's challenges are a test directly from God, that if it's hard, if it's challenging, God must be testing me. But there's a really important distinction to make here in this story. Our passage connects testing to the Lord's words, not to the people's circumstances. The passage does not say that God inflicts thirst on people. He makes them thirsty, withholding water from them in order to test them. And in the story that's going to come, we're not told that God withholds food from them in order to test them. No, what God does is he gives instructions. He speaks words to his people. He commands them. And the test is that regardless of the circumstances, what do they do with his words? The people are in a wilderness. Their destination requires that they travel through this wilderness. But part of the territory, by definition of a wilderness, is sparse resources and plentiful danger, right? God intends to provide for his people, and he is going to do so generously. But what do the people do with his words, whether they're in plenty or in want? This is the answer to the test. God's revelation ought to lead to some measure of matured trust. A life lived as though God is able to and wants to be faithful to his promises. It's not as though God is leading Israel on the hardest path possible. In fact, we were already told in previous weeks that God gave them an alternate route to actually make it easier for them. He is merely taking them where they need to go and teaching them to trust him along the way. And so let's transition to the next test and talk not about water, but about food. And to do so, we have to look at two different passages, just like Derek did with us last week with Miriam. Like with Miriam, we have two accounts. One is the first slope of your triangle, and then there's a climax in the middle, and then the second is the slope down. Both of these accounts involve the Israelites, God's people in the wilderness, wanting food. We have one of these stories. The first one is these people on their way from Egypt, recently freed, on their way to Mount Sinai to meet with God. And then the second story is as they leave Mount Sinai, they've been there for a year and they're on their way to the promised land. And in between these two events is a year. The Israelites spend almost an entire year camped around Mount Sinai. The Israelites ought to be different as a result of this experience with God. As we asked of the sea earlier, what difference will a year at God's mountain make for these people? And so let's take a look at a bit of this first food event. And we start at Exodus chapter 16. They set out from Elim, and all of the congregation of the people of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had departed from the land of Egypt. And the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the people of Israel said to them, "Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Couple things to note here. First is that meat pots sound awesome, right? That sounds like the best camping trip ever. Just, I don't know what kind of meat was in it, but I would be down for meat pots. But secondly, perhaps more important, hunger has now legitimately begun to set in for these people. Whatever bread the Israelites brought out of Egypt is now legitimately gone, it seems, and the people are in need of food. And so again, like infants, crying when they are hungry, the Israelites grumble. But they do more than grumble. This time they begin to speak longingly of their past, of their time in Egypt. They begin to identify with their captors, even in their death. And they somehow have come to the assumption that God intends to kill them. On one hand, this is just craziness, right? We read this story sort of detached from it, and it seems like utter insanity. We remember all the way back to the beginning of Exodus in chapter 2, the Israelites, they were groaning under the weight of their bitter affliction. It was terrible. So really? They would really rather have died with the Egyptians than be alive here and now with the Lord? How in the world did they come to decide that the Lord was against them? As crazy as this seems, it also makes a lot of sense. These are an infant people. They have been given a brand new life that they haven't a clue how to live yet. Up until this point, God has demanded very little from them. They have only followed as God has continued to sort of perform for them. Now their food stores have run out and the performances have stopped, and they don't even seem to think another show is even possible. They merely assume it is time to die. An infant knows and is familiar with the mother that nurses her. And as slaves in Egypt, it is likely that Israel did eat, at least enough to maintain their ability to work as slaves. Israel has been taken from its nursing mother and must relearn to trust another provider. This can be a painful process. But there's more here in Israel's story that is infantile. Infants live in the moment. While they have an attachment to past providers, they only know how to respond to a present crisis. Thus far, this is all that Israel seems capable of doing. They are threatened and they cry out in fear. They are thirsty and they grumble. They are hungry and they grumble. And for those who are infants in faith, we all start there. God's words function a couple ways for us and meet us there in our infancy. In one respect, God's words are a comforting reminder that God is with his people. In this story, God tells his people that he has heard their grumbling the same way that he heard their cries and he heard their groanings before. Here too, God hears their grumbling, and now God says he's going to provide for them. And in a second way, God's words are more than just a present comfort, but they call us toward growing and maturing trust in him. See, God's words often reach beyond our present circumstances so that we can begin to look beyond today to see where God is taking us. God's instructions will require the people to actually do something that will demonstrate their either the presence or the absence of trust. As God provides them food, they are going to have to begin to enact some sort of visible trust in this God. And the Lord says to them in verse 4, the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my instructions or not. It's important to notice that again. On their journey to Sinai from Egypt, God is remarkably gracious with these infant people. Without a hint of frustration, he instructs them. He leads them. Without any anger, he provides them both meat and manna, this breadish stuff, because this is what they've asked for, both meat and bread. And so God has given to them. But more than this, God sets in place a whole system, an elaborate system. In chapter 16, lays it all out, whereby his people can expect daily provision by God for their food that will require on their part some sort of faithful response. So the question becomes, what happens a year from now? What happens when a year goes by and day after day, God has provided this breadish stuff, and God speaks. And God makes promises, and then God begins to lead these people to the land flowing with milk and honey. What will happen to these people? Will they begin to grow in this maturing trust in God, or will they become something else? And so we turn to the book of Numbers to read the second side of the triangle. We pick up in chapter 11. The people have just left Sinai and are heading toward Canaan when they have a minor incident of complaint and correction here at the beginning of chapter 11. And then we start reading in verse 4. Now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving. And the people of Israel also wept again and said, "Oh, that we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt that cost nothing, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our strength is dried up, and there is nothing at all but this manna to look at." And we're off. A new time, a new place, but the same old story, right? Actually, no. The story is already different in so many of its details. The context is different. See, whereas the last time the people were legitimately hungry, this time they crave more than a belly that has been made full by God. Last time, we got a basic account of life in Egypt as they spoke longingly of it. They ate meat and they had bread and they had enough to live and to work hard. But this time, we get a serious case of revisionist history. Remember the fish is their rally cry, right? And the melons and the garlic. Oh, and the veggies. To return to those good old days. This is insane. We've read the story. God's people have an incredible tendency toward this kind of revisionist history, where dissatisfied with the present, we begin to reimagine an alternative past, and we pine longingly for it. The first clue that somebody is engaged in this kind of revisionist history is that when questioned, when poked, when prodded, they can't come up with anything negative about that time. Their ability to reimagine the past should strike us. The Israelites have been at the base of Sinai for a year. This isn't just like a church service. This is a mountain with a pillar of smoke and fire on it. They've heard the mountain echo with God's words. They've received his instructions. They have rebelled. Large numbers of them have been slaughtered, and they have received his mercy. And then at the end of Leviticus, we're told this. They receive this word from God, that if they walk in his statutes and observe his commandments, that in the promised land, they would have an abundance of food and fruit. Everything about their last year was all God all the time. And yet, in this moment of discontentment, they have one frame of reference: Egypt. It's not even an accurate version of Egypt. It's this highly romanticized version, but yet in their moment of discontentment, they don't even go back to how great it was at the mountain. They go further beyond that, back to their slavery. There's more to it than this, because it would be a mistake for us to think, well, those poor people, they had to eat that breadish manna stuff for a whole year. Of course they would want more, right? But they had actually just had meat somewhat recently. The way that they cry out for meat, you would think that it had been a decade since they had had it. But they just had it. They just had their second Passover within the last month. And so at a minimum, they had meat a few weeks ago. But also with the construction of the tabernacle being completed, they actually now had a means where they were permitted to even eat some of their own livestock that was with them. These are not a people who are in need. These are not a people with a legitimate complaint. These are people who have grown entitled in God's grace. They are no longer infants. They are bratty, whiny toddlers who stomp their feet and throw temper tantrums when they don't get their own way. The people are on their way to the land that God has promised. There, within the prescribed boundaries that God has given them, they are going to eat in abundance. Bread and fruit and meat, it'll all be there. God is not withholding good things from them, but they are traveling. And when you travel, you can't do certain things that you can do when you are stationary, and they cannot wait. They are on their way to Disneyland. And at a gas station, they're a 3-year-old who's stomping and crying and just says, I want to be at Disneyland right now. They may not be in the land yet, but they have all the food they could need. Every single day, the Lord has provided for them. And they are not content. Last week, Derek suggested that Miriam's rebellion against Moses had something to do with her forgetting her song. She had forgotten the song of salvation that she had once led the Israelite women in singing, and so jealousy crept in. Here too, I think we see the results of the salvation song being unsung. The song, first led by Moses and then echoed by Miriam, that declared the strong right hand of God, has now changed in this story. Which, as you were reading the daily worship guide, you should have read through both of these kind of in their entirety. The question changes about God's ability to provide extra, for God's hand, his arm, to be faithful. And then in verse 23, we hear the Lord say this to Moses. Is the Lord's hand shortened? It's kind of a funny visual, right? Now you shall see whether my word will come true for you or not. Last week, Derek urged us to see how bored the people had become with God's words. This week, we see how bored the people have become with God's provision. Exodus, the first story, hints that when God provided quail as meat, it was a one-time thing up front. The bread, the manna was an ongoing thing, but the manna was the quail was one time. But here, the people and you can hear it, childlike fashion, plead for God to do it again, do it again. In Exodus, God wasn't bothered by their lack of trust. He generously met them where they were at. But here, God demonstrates genuine anger as he expects more from these people. And his response is fascinating. To not only give them what they want, but to make them sick of it. To give them so much that it is, we'll read it in a second. Last time he only gave them a day's worth. This time, he says, you shall eat for a whole month until it is coming out of your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you, because you rejected the Lord who is among you and have wept before him, saying, why did we come out of Egypt? It's fascinating to me that the largest group of people leaving the church in the United States in the last decade are boomers, the boomer generation. Boomers are the very people who created the seeker-sensitive movement. They're the very ones who transformed worship services into entertainment venues with concert-style experiences. And now, bored with the entertaining church they craved, the way that they were already bored with God, they have decided to begin leaving. This event in Numbers should have revealed a people with a maturing trust in God. But instead, their trust has turned into entitlement. And God, faithful to his word in Exodus, strikes these people with a plague. The second story doesn't say anything about God testing the Israelites. He doesn't need to. He has given them his instructions, and they will put themselves to the test by the way that they live, and by the way that they pray, and by the way that they worship, and by the way that they crave. They will put themselves to the test. And as a people, it's not so much that they fail to trust. They actually seem to fail the test of being interested in God at all. They aren't even interested in God, let alone trusting him. They don't crave or desire God, his words, or his provisions. Their hearts still belong in Egypt. The moment of discontentment, that is where their minds go. That is all they can think of. And so where do our hearts belong? What do we desire? What do we crave? When you come to the table Sunday after Sunday, do you find yourself satisfied with God's offering? His own body, his own blood? Or do you need more to sort of get you excited to follow him? Are his words sufficient for you to live by? Is the provision of his own life enough? This is what we come to the table to remember week after week. That through Jesus, God has acted to bring us out of our slavery to sin and death. That through Jesus, God has been delivering us from our slavery to sin and death, and that through Jesus, God has redeemed us from sin and death. And with Jesus, this is the promise that we announce every time we come to the table, that with Jesus, God will take us into his kingdom. And for that, we look forward to that day. And that is where our trust lies and what it means for us to walk with him.